Good morning, everybody. I hope you all are continuing to stay safe and healthy. Welcome to the first of a three-part series that we're kicking off this fall to bring you great content and programming. We're focused today on the crisis that we see on our streets, the crisis of mental health and substance use disorder. That was a significant challenge going into the pandemic, and that has in many ways been exacerbated by COVID. In many ways, the streets and parks and alleys and sidewalks of Seattle have become one of our region's largest mental health and substance use treatment facilities. But it's a facility that lacks four walls and a roof and hygiene and laundry, and importantly, treatment. But that is the sad and tragic reality that we face today. And it's not to suggest that there aren't incredible nonprofits and public and private sector entities doing great work in this area. But that work is necessary, but not sufficient. And we need new approaches, new investments to reach the people that are in need, that are not getting the help today. The 40 or so tents that are in Denny Park this morning, the people living along the freeway, along Green Lake, the folks who slept in alleys and on sidewalks last night. We need to do better as a community to meet this crisis and this emergency. That is the topic of today's virtual access event, and we have an incredible panel to bring you their thinking on the new approaches that we must embrace to make a difference on our streets and importantly for the people in need. To moderate today's panel, I'm very excited to have a great friend and partner of the Downtown Seattle Association, Felix Bunnell. If you don't know Felix, he's a producer, a host, a historian for Cairo Radio. For a number of years, he served as the deputy director at the Museum of History and Industry. And if you love the Pacific Northwest and history and great storytelling, and you're not already following Felix, you should be following and listening to Felix on Cairo, on mynorthwest.com, on his Facebook page. Just an incredible storyteller and asset to our community and making sure we always remember our history and hold up those great stories. I'm really pleased to be able to turn this moderator's chair over to a professional, Felix, you moderating this fall series. And through the power and magic of Zoom, Emily will make me disappear and the floor is yours.
Well, I guess since that professional can't join us, you'll have to settle for me today. Thanks, John, for the introduction, and thanks, DSA, for organizing this event today and the whole series for later in the fall. We've got a great panel who I'll introduce to you in a few moments. First, I want to introduce a member of the DSA staff. It's DSA Metropolitan Improvement District Outreach Manager, Chris Park. Chris has firsthand experience with crisis response in downtown Seattle at street level. Chris, do you want to take a few minutes and sort of set the scene in downtown Seattle for us?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Felix. Good morning, everyone. Pre-COVID, there were already enough challenges and barriers for individuals experiencing homelessness and getting access to various services. Now, as we are in the middle of this pandemic, those barriers and difficulties have grown infinitely more. One of the biggest challenges right now is shelter access. As of this morning, in all of the city of Seattle, there are 4 vacancies for men who are experiencing homelessness, and only 4 vacancies for women experiencing homelessness. So by end of business day today, if we're lucky, only 8 individuals are going to be moved off of sidewalks and into at least a place where they can have a roof over their head tonight as they're heading into this winter season. The shelter access has just been even more challenging just due to COVID, just due to social distancing, and also just some of the requirements. Some shelters do require that once a week, individuals staying at the shelter be receiving a COVID test. And for some individuals who are experiencing severe mental illness, who may display symptoms of paranoia, that's just not going to fly for them. They're just not going to be open to that level of what they might feel would be an invasion of their privacy. And so it just makes that work that much more difficult. Another difficulty that we're facing right now due to COVID is access to Washington State ID. A lot of individuals that we work with may have never had a Washington State ID before, and in order to get them a new one, or for them to get a first-time Washington State ID, they have to have a walk-in appointment at the DOL. As of yesterday afternoon, when I left my office in all of the Puget Sound area, there were no walk-in appointments available for the next 30 days. And the DOL will not take appointments beyond 30 days. So we actually currently, just for our organization and for my team, we have 4 clients who are employment ready, meaning that they actually have job offers waiting for them. And the only barrier right now is the fact that they don't have state issue ID. And so it's trying to navigate that for them, whereas they are trying to better their situation and that they've gotten to the point to where they have enough stability to be able to be employed. We have to tell them no, simply because of not being able to provide this service. And the last thing that I think is a difficulty as well is that there, as with every sector and everyone as we're experiencing this COVID pandemic, is just for service providers trying to figure out how do we offer care, how do we offer access to services in a manner that's safe for everyone, you know, whether it be taking temperatures and masks. Most agencies still don't have consistent walk-in hours for individuals to come in and meet with their case manager, which is difficult to try to do telehealth when your client doesn't have access to a phone. And so, yeah, so those are just some of the barriers that we're facing right now, Felix.
I mean, this was already a complex and complicated issue before COVID-19 and the economic collapse that followed that. So, I mean, it's only worse now. But it also has exposed a lot of things that were known by a lot of people like you, probably, Chris, but that now are just in stark contrast to the way that we want things to be. Now, for this complex and complicated issue, we have an amazing set of panelists today. I want to take time to briefly introduce all 3 of them. Then we'll give each of them a chance to sort of introduce themselves and the work that they and their organizations are doing to address these issues. First of all is Leo Floor. He's director of the King County Department of Community and Human Services, or DCHS. He's been in this role since late 2018. You know, DCHS runs the King County programs for affordable housing, homelessness, behavioral health care, and persons with disabilities. They also administer Best Starts for Kids levy, and Veteran Seniors and Human Services levy, and the Behavioral Health Sales Tax Fund. Next up is Amy King, who's the owner and CEO of Pallet and co-founder of the nonprofit Weld Seattle. Pallet builds shelters and hires and invests in people actively engaged in recovery and reintegration. Now, Weld Seattle is a nonprofit that works to remove barriers to employment, housing, and supportive community for individuals engaged in reentry. Now, Weld's also behind something called 1426. We're going to hear more about this, of course. It's a collaborative reentry resource center at 1426 South Jackson that a lot will be happening there next year. Now, our third and final panelist joins us from California. It's Kerry Morrison. She's project director for Heart Forward LA. It's a nonprofit. The mission involves transforming the American mental health system through radical hospitality. Kerry helped found Heart Forward in 2019 after spending 22 years leading the Business Improvement District in Hollywood and experiencing firsthand the challenges and frustrations of helping people who need it the most. So let's start with Leo. And Leo, if you can sort of introduce yourself and tell us about what your agency is doing to address the crises that we're talking about this morning.
Yeah, thanks, Felix. And good morning again, Leo Floor. That picture is of me, just sort of pre-COVID hair growth there. King County DCHS, what we really are focusing on right now is this realization that COVID has really brought to the fore. We had to change a lot of things in a really quick reaction to try to keep people safe and healthy in the context of COVID. And what we found is that a lot of the things that work for that are actually turning out to work really well for a lot of the other health conditions that cause suffering and that make it really difficult for folks to progress out of homelessness. And so there's a sales tax that actually the King County Council enacted 2 days ago now, and some folks may have heard about that, but the effort here is to try to take advantage of a COVID economy where a lot of hospitality industry facilities may be cheaper than they otherwise would have been. And then to really try to act quickly, purchase those facilities and then convert them into emergency housing. Right now, we're aiming to get 2,000 folks and really trying to aim for chronically homeless people in particular. And the reason why we think this is going to work is University of Washington just published a study that it has worked. in a really recent application in hotels that we've gotten rent into in Seattle and one in SeaTac, where not only did we prove that you could slow empirically the spread of COVID, but we actually have much better sort of physical and behavioral health outcomes for the people who are staying there right now. So I'll put a link to that in the chat, but just wanted to start with that. This is an area where a lot of people feel hopelessness. They don't know what would work, or it becomes a philosophical discussion. And I think something that should really encourage us all is the data is actually there. And we actually do know what works. And I think the responsibility we have is to now follow what works, even if it doesn't match any of our preconceived notions of what should work. So I can stop there, but that's what we're really focused on right now, trying to use evidence and data to make a big difference on a problem that's really important.
Oh, that's great. I like that notion of sort of addressing preconceived notions and changing people's perceptions. I think so much of this is about the general public's perception. Now let's go to Amy King of Pallet and Weld Seattle.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Great to meet you all. My name is Amy King. I am founder and CEO of Pallet Shelter. We make panelized rapid deployment homeless and disaster response shelters. We use them all over the West Coast to get people into shelter quickly. So much like what Leo was talking about, minus the purchase of a permanent building. So they are temporary shelters that go up in about 20 minutes. And we're working with cities across the West Coast, including Los Angeles and some other larger cities, Sacramento and whatnot. So also, I am the founder of Weld Seattle. We are a nonprofit organization operating locally here that provides housing and employment connections and resources to individuals as they exit the criminal justice system. As many of you know from some reports that came out of DSA recently, we have some frequent offenders here in Seattle, and we have a lot of people that release from the criminal justice system into King County without access to resources. So our goal is to create that opportunity, that access to resources so that people can re-enter successfully and stay out of prison. Weld has a less than 3% recidivism rate. The national average across the country is 77%. The reason for our success is Weld is entirely run by people with lived experience. So people who have personally experienced the criminal justice system, addiction recovery, and homelessness themselves. So that relatability of our programs is really, really successful. And as Felix mentioned, we are very excited to announce that next year we are going to be opening 1426, which is a collaborative reentry resource center bringing together a whole bunch of organizations in the Seattle community, Recovery Cafe, and a whole bunch of different groups to offer targeted services to individuals, mental health services, addiction recovery, connection to housing, all kinds of stuff. So we're really excited to share that with you guys, and there'll be a Seattle Times piece coming out this week with more info about that.
All right, thank you, Amy. Now our third panelist is joining us from California. It's Kerry Morrison of Heart Forward, LA.
Hi, hello everybody. I just so love zooming into Seattle because actually you guys inspire me. I'm not even sure what I can offer from the homeless capital of the country. I feel this sense of dismay that we all feel about this human tragedy on our streets. And just, you know, briefly, I did manage the bid in Hollywood for 22 years. And as homelessness continued to become increasingly challenging, and I had a particular interest in the plight of people with severe mental illness that, for all intents and purposes, completely seemed to be forgotten by our systems. They really were not easy to house. I don't even think housing first works for people with severe mental illness. I was awarded a fellowship, a 2-year fellowship from a foundation here in Los Angeles that gave me free reign for 2 years to take time away from my job, you know, that they would reimburse, to explore a different approach. And that journey led me to Italy, led me to Trieste. And you can read about it on my website, heartforwardla.org. That model in Italy is recognized by the World Health Organization as the global best practice for community-based mental health care. They built a system of community care in Trieste when they finally closed their asylum in 1980. And the experience of going there, and I've been back there 5 times, and I lived there for a month, opened my eyes to the fact that we can do better as human beings, but the American system, which I would argue is not a system, is completely broken. ties the hands of anyone who has the heart to want to do good work. Whether you're a social worker, a clinician, a peer, the American system seems to be completely overrun with rules and regulations and fear of lawsuits and risk management, whereas the Italian system actually operates on the basis of human kindness. So I quit my job. I walked away from the bid. I gave my board 6 months notice, and I said, I have seen something that has to be shared. And we had, prior to the pandemic, a commitment from the state of California to fund a pilot in Hollywood, a 5-year pilot, to test some of these guiding principles from Italy in Hollywood. And they were willing to fund it to the tune of $116 million. And then the pandemic hit. So all of that is on hold. So I'm just using this time now to keep telling this amazing story. You can't shut me up, but I'll shut up right now.
Well, no, actually, hang on a second, because I'm curious if you can sort of summarize what is magical about the Trieste approach, and what is it possible to scale it up for a place like Southern California or a place like Seattle?
Yeah, I believe it is. You know, their fundamental. They believe that people have a right to purpose in their life. So similar to what Amy is working on with the reentry and, you know, employment, they believe in the human right to a sense of purpose, to a sense of vocation. And they have built opportunities throughout the community. The whole community is engaged. There's no silos. People are welcomed in the city to learn, to work to whatever extent that they can. They believe that this is should not be approached as a medical model, but as a whole person model. So when you walk into a community mental health center in Trieste, you don't know who are the users of the system and who are the clinicians. They're horizontal relationships. People have agency in kind of defining their life story, and families are involved. Families, of course, are marginalized in the American system. And also law enforcement is the last person you would call for a crisis response in Trieste.
And so how would you scale that up in a place like Los Angeles or a place like Seattle? I mean, it sounds wonderful the way you describe it. It sounds like it's based on compassion and humanity. And I know there's differences in the way Medicaid funds patients here in the US versus how they fund individuals in Italy. So is there enormous amounts of red tape? Is there an issue of persuasion required to have something like this adopted on a grand scale?
Yeah, so having managed a bid, I never quite understood how mental health services were paid for, and Leo can certainly speak to this. But to your point, one of the innovations that were going to be tested in the pilot was to create a per capita system of care, to set aside the Medicaid fee-for-service model so that you wouldn't be restricted to only providing clinical services, but to have a per capita budget for the 4,000 people we figured would have been in this catchment area to provide any and all services. So as Christopher said, if you needed to get your ID card, that the mental health services could do that. Right now they can't because it's not going to be reimbursed by Medicaid.
And now, Amy, you said that sounds like what you're doing with or planning with 1426 seems very similar to what the Trieste model is and what Kerry is doing in California or trying to do in California. How does what you're planning fit into this kind of model?
Yeah, so the concept with WELD is the idea that in order for people to succeed as they sort of re-enter society and participate again, is they need purpose, as Kerry mentioned, so a job, or if they can't work, some sort of act of service or a way to fill their time that gives them some sort of sense of purpose of they're doing something within their community. We help with that. So WELD has a great program called WELD Works that's run by an awesome man, Jay Pershing. He connects people that are looking for work with job opportunities, and we help consult with employers that are interested in second chance employment and working with people that are traditionally marginalized, helping them both sides make connections so that people can get work. We also, the other piece is housing. So obviously, as Leo mentioned, we definitely need more housing. We know that permanent housing takes a really long time to build and is very costly. So in the meantime, we have to get people into some sort of stable housing so that they can stabilize and be safe and secure. So that might look like emergency shelter, or in our case, what we do is we utilize vacant developer properties that are awaiting permits, and we turn them into clean and sober living houses that are transitional community housing with accountability and meetings and opportunity for people to support one another and live together in community. So that's kind of that radical hospitality that Kerry was talking about, where you put people together with lived experiences that can share their recovery experience together. And that has been wildly successful for us. We've been doing that for about 4 years, all across Seattle. Many people here, you might have had a Weld House in your neighborhood and not even known it, and they're very successful. And then that last piece is that community. So if someone has stable housing, purpose through a job or service, and then a community that they can be a part of and feel like they belong, we have really proven through our theory that that works. And it's the same theory that Kerry's talking about. And I wish I had gone to Italy. I wish I knew about it. I really want to go now. But it's the exact same idea of if you put people together in community. So 1426 is really meant to bring people together around services, around events, around, we're gonna have art and music and yoga and trauma-informed care therapy type stuff there. And so we're really excited to offer this both for the larger community to engage, but also for this community to engage with one another and really find that healing that they need together. So that's what we're working on.
Now, Leo, when I hear about initiatives like what Amy is doing with 1426, and I hear about what Kerry's group is doing in Los Angeles, it seems like the notion of regional coordination could be really key to having this stuff be really effective. I know last year, Mayor Durkin and County Executive Constantine helped create the Regional Homelessness Authority. I imagine you work pretty closely with that entity. What's the status of the Regional Homeless Authority, and what's its role in, I don't know, orchestrating or coordinating the kinds of things that we've already talked about this morning?
Yeah. Well, first, just to draw a connection from what Kerry and Amy have been talking about, I think is really relevant to this. So I think you can think of a lot of the work that we have to do right now is fusing back together a system that is fragmented because of the way that we fund it. You really can trace a lot of this back to the way that we have chosen to fund our system, in the United States, in Washington, and here in King County and Seattle. And, Kerry mentioned this thing that happened in the 80s in Italy that also happened here in the 60s, which is we had these asylums where we kept people. We decided that for humanitarian reasons that was unacceptable, but Italy and the United States went very different directions from there. And the way that the United States went was not to base in community and activate a lot of these networks that everybody is talking about here, but instead we went and we sort of adopted the system that John talked about in the beginning, where we actually fund these services in fragmented ways through human services and through the carceral system, through the legal system. And so, we ended up here by a set of policy choices. And I highlight that only because we can begin to come back through a set of policy choices. And the Regional Homelessness Authority is an attempt to do that. It's an attempt to take a fractured system and begin to knit it back together. Implementation-wise, where we are, we've got the interlocal agreement signed. We are looking for a CEO right now, so I think that job posting will open up here shortly. And then the goal is to get that person in so that they can begin to hire staff and we can begin to transfer programs to them. The implementation is moving slower than we'd sort of planned pre-COVID. So a lot of energy went into redistributing shelter populations and trying to keep people safe during COVID. And I think right now the higher timeline would have that CEO starting in January, and that's when we're going to begin to be able to transfer programs there. And then the second thing that I think Amy brought up that's really useful to talk about is that the new authority is not just a bureaucratic sort of rearrangement of the ship. It's really trying to get a different theory in place, and it's one that brings people who have experienced homelessness into the decision-making apparatus in a formal way, in meaningful proportion at all levels, to try to recognize the fact that human services is actually one of the few places where we don't value the customer's input about how we should deliver the services. If this is a business audience, to all of you, it would be ridiculous to do things in ways that didn't meet your customers' needs. But for some reason in human services and maybe government policy more generally, we tend to try to meet the needs of people who are not the customers, but who have opinions about the customers more than we try to meet the needs of the customers themselves.
Yeah, that's sort of that public persuasion component that I think is interesting to me, given that the crisis has sort of ebbed and flowed in the forefront of the media over the last several years. And in terms of crisis response, this is a question could be for all three of you. What do we do to sort of break that kind of the tendency to want to address things that are most visible and that might not be the biggest problem, but they're the most visible to the general public. How do we work upstream to solve the root causes that go back to these things you talked about, Leo, like institutions closing decades ago and the fragmentation of how people are treated? What policies are you talking about, and how do we address those streams or those causes further upstream?
Well, I will just venture into this. One of the things we did while I was still leading the bid is we became frustrated at the inability of the county to meaningfully intervene into the lives of people who were stranded on the street with severe mental illness. So we created our own team of non-governmental people, so we would not be hamstrung by HIPAA, by privacy rules, by the things that sometimes constrain response. And we identified a list of what we call the Hollywood top 14, the 14 most severely mentally ill people most likely to die on the streets of Hollywood. And in fact, 3 of them did. And that became my learning about system dysfunctionality that Leo also references. One of the things that we found to be very important in dealing with the Hollywood top 14 was to have continuity in connection points, the same case manager or the same friend, and it could be a friend. It didn't have to be someone with an LCSW at the end of their name, but that consistent person, so that if a person ended up in jail, that person would go visit them in jail. If they ended up in the ER, that person would show up. And our American system seems to be constantly handing people off to others. Right now, if we someone, we'll say, we'll check the inmate locator at LA County Jail. Oh, there they are. And so somehow the people fall through the net, and there needs to be almost like a dedicated lifetime case management system that keeps people connected to the mothership, as it were.
That would have to be something federal. That couldn't just be a county or state thing. I mean, because the borders are fluid and people move around, and especially on the West Coast, the mythology at least is that people move up and down the West Coast to different cities. So are you talking about something on a federal level?
I'm kind of restricting that to people with severe mental illness that I would say rarely wander more than a half a mile in any direction. So I'm focusing on that particular cohort, a very small group of people that we have left abandoned. Yes, for other folks who do kind of move across the country, that's a whole different model. That's what I'm thinking about right now.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would add that, I think policy is really important, of course, and these are things we need to address, but more than that, we need to address the human bias and the need for relationship and understanding, because policy doesn't break that down, right? And I think, I see it here in Seattle a lot. You see people are, burned out, they're tired of the situation and seeing people on the streets, and I am too, I get it. But the more we can expose ourselves to people with that lived experience to understand, the more we break down that bias and we're willing to engage in really tangible ways. So for example, giving someone a job at your place of employment that you normally might not be willing to employ. So someone with a criminal background or someone who has lived experience in homelessness. But I think, to go back to your original question, Felix, I think, in our theory, elevating people with lived experience, as Leo was talking about, is really important. And I think it goes beyond what we typically see in government, which is, I'm going to create a panelist, for example, or an advisory board of people with lived experience. That's great. That's a really good first start. I would argue that's not enough. We need people with lived experience leading organizations, acting as executive directors, getting trained as social workers and substance abuse counselors. And I hear it all over the country. People say, we don't have enough mental health workers in this country to deal with the problem. I disagree. You have hundreds of thousands of people coming out of addiction, working AA and NA programs. They have the lived experience that we need. Maybe they don't have a 4-year degree in social work, but there is no reason why those people cannot be actively engaged in helping people on the streets, and they want to. Every time I work with someone who comes out of prison, they say to me, all I want is to go back in and help my friends and help the people that are coming out. Now I've walked successfully out and stayed out. I want to turn around and help the person behind me come out. We have a massive pool of people that are willing to do this work. We need to equip them to do that work and elevate their voices.
If I could just follow on to that, Felix, I think sometimes all this talk about relationships and networks and belonging, it can feel unsubstantial. It can feel like non-empirical. It can feel woo, to use that term. There's actually a ton of research here. And it, there's this concept that's, I think, really emerging right now called network impoverishment. And the idea is that what is causing individual folks to experience all the things that we're talking about here is really the disruption or destruction of their personal network. And that you can really think of the entire field of human services and all that we are talking about here as attempts to replicate or repair the networks that most of us enjoy naturally, whether they're human relationships, access to capital, access to resources. And so individuals sort of lose resiliency when they're not connected to institutions or connected to other people, and then they become isolated. And there's, I just wanted to put a plug in for this idea that this is not just I don't want to deal with the facts, so I'm going to talk about emotions. This is very much actually the core, and understanding the problem the right way is going to be the key to implementing solutions that are more effective.
Yeah. And then how do you communicate, which is a fairly complex way of describing what for a lot of people is just, the issue of people they see on the street blocking the entrance to their business or blocking the entrance to their office or somehow sort of detracting from their experience downtown. How do you communicate the kinds of solutions we're talking about now to that broader audience who's in some cases has grown very impatient with what they see as just a continued problem that the outward look of it hasn't changed for them necessarily, the average person on the street. But so how do you reach those critical people whose support for bond measures or voting for things or just their moral support is critical for this kind of solution?
I could take a quick stab and then would love to hear what Amy and Kerry think. I think you have to do something that works, let people see that it worked, and then build from there. I am not a career-long human services person. I was in the Army for my first career. And in the Army, you either win or you lose. And it doesn't matter what you were thinking. And I think we can bring some of that same mentality here where do things that work and show it. And just a really concrete example that I think this audience is going to know very well. Before COVID, we have the biggest shelter in Seattle, the DSA main shelter on 3rd Avenue in the courthouse, the Morrison, sometimes it's called. That's a group of folks where you could just see a ton of human suffering on the street every day. In March, we picked those folks up. We put them, it's the same folks, we put them into a hotel in Renton. Those are the folks that are in that Red Lion Hotel in Renton. And the change that happened for those specific people was remarkable. You go to the staff at DESC and they'll say they don't even physically recognize folks. It's the fact that they could sleep in a bed. They could close their door. They had access to a bathroom. They had access to steady nutrition. And just those basics have stabilized that population. That's what the UW really took a look at. It didn't solve everything. It is not like the single thing you do that is a panacea, but it sets this foundation to then reestablish a network, to feel safety, dignity, to feel belonging. And that is the sort of platform that all of us need to then be able to do hard things like recover from addiction, or to, develop ourselves to seek a job. Life is hard already, even under ideal circumstances. We all know that this year. And I think it was really neat to be able to prove something with a group of people that most folks recognize and have seen, and it worked. And now we're going to try to take that to scale because I think it's part of the solution.
I will just add that while I was managing the bid, initially my board told me, this is not your work. We are clean and safe, and somebody else is going to be involved with tackling homelessness. And as the situation continued to decline, I quietly went off and never told them how much I was doing to start to get engaged in that issue. But over time, what I felt I had to do, I personally had to conquer my own fear. And I started to, just as Amy is suggesting, sitting down and talking to people in my bid on a bus bench, people who are frightening to me, who are intimidating. And I crossed the threshold that Leo is talking about from a person who is anonymous to actually a person who has a human story. And where are your parents? And where did you come from? And why are you here? And those were transformational experiences for me. So I tried to the extent that I could to help members of my board and the business community have those experiences also. Somebody asked in the chat, how do we as residents and businesses assist? Find one person that you see, you know, sitting on that bus bench and they've been there for 2 years. I have on my blog, which I provided a link to, like a 5-step process to trying to engage with someone who is wandering in your neighborhood. It can take a year, it can take longer, but I guarantee you, if you are intentional about it, it's going to open your eyes to just the human situation that is playing out on our streets. And I think it can help to turn hearts and minds.
What I like about that is that reminds me of during World War II, where, you know, obviously we were fighting enemies on other fronts across the oceans, but they very cleverly put people to work here in the States in ways that they could feel like they were contributing to the solution, whether it was scrap drives or war bond purchasing or whatever. There was some sense that somebody in charge was saying, yeah, here's the problem. Here's how we're addressing it. Here's how you individually, personally can make a difference. And I like what you're saying there. I mean, that's a pretty serious commitment to take a year to connect with somebody in your neighborhood, but I understand why it would take that long. But it would be great if there was some kind of coordinated effort to instruct people how to do that, because I would guess there's not a shortage of people who want to help, but just don't know how to do it, don't know how to actually make an individual difference in something that's part of a bigger plan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would love to just add to what was said, that I agree with Leo, but I'm going to push back just a little bit and say that I think one of the biggest things that we have to be open to in order to solve this crisis is innovation. And yes, I agree that we should do things that work, and conceptually we know some of these things work, but I think what frustrates most people, including myself, is we keep funding the same things over and over and over again, and the problem isn't getting any better, it's getting worse. And we keep hearing, well, there's not enough affordable housing, which is true, but that's just one piece of the puzzle. I think it's a false perception to say, well, just because there's not enough housing, if we had enough housing, there wouldn't be homelessness. That's just not true. There are people who migrate out into the streets because they're looking for a place to belong, and they're going back to a community that they know. And I think we have to address that as well. We have to address the mental health issues. We have to address the root causes, which everyone agrees with. But we have to do that with innovation. So you hear a lot where people say, well, we went out to the streets, we swept a camp in Seattle, we asked how many people who would take services, and very few agreed. And the assumption that's made from that is those people want to be there and they don't want services. That's a false assumption. If you speak to those people and you actually ask them their story, what you'll hear is they have a history of trauma, significant trauma, and PTSD, and they don't want to go to a congregate shelter. They want a private place where their PTSD isn't triggered. That's fair. Can we accommodate that? Maybe, maybe not. But like what Leo's talking about, maybe we need to invest in more purchasing hotels, like that's worked in Seattle, or we need to look at individual shelter options like Pallet, or like tiny home communities where people can have the dignity of their own space and some privacy to do their recovery work. We just have to start thinking differently, in my opinion, about how we solve this issue, and start, you know, this is what we did at Weld. We call it the spaghetti model. We started throwing spaghetti noodles at the wall, and if they stuck, we kept going, and if they fell down, we stopped. And we didn't have any public funding. We were totally funded privately, so we had the authority and privilege to do that. We were flexible. We could pivot. We could adjust programming depending on our clients' needs and what they were asking for, because we weren't focused on empirical data and what worked. We were focused on what was working right then and now with those people immediately. And you know, whether that's right or wrong, I think it's been effective. And I think Seattle's one of the most innovative cities in the country. If anything, we should be trying new things here. And if it doesn't work, okay, fine, let's do something else.
You know, one of the things you mentioned, Amy, the navigation team, which has recently sort of went away here in Seattle. What do we lose by not having the navigation team anymore out on the streets of the city? Anybody?
Well, in my opinion, we've lost quite a bit, but I would say, you know, I don't know enough about it to have a really solid opinion, but I will say having people available to help is really necessary. Who makes up that navigation team is also really important, right? So in my opinion and in my experience, if I go out on the streets, I mean, I'm a privileged girl from Edmonds. If I go out on the streets and I start talking to homeless people, they're going to be like, who the hell are you and what are you doing here? I don't want to talk to you. And that's fair. I don't have any sort of relatability to them. If I take my staff from Weld out on the streets, they have experience and they can say, hey man, I've been where you are. I know what you're going through. Let me help you. what happens there is going to be way more effective than anything I could do, or someone in a police uniform, or someone, you know, who's got a really awesome degree but doesn't have any experience. I think you have to kind of build those teams to be more inclusive. So someone who has the experience, the mental health and social work experience, but put people with lived experience, embed them in the teams as well. That's my opinion.
Leo, were you going to jump in on that one? Or you?
Yeah, I can. You know, the navigation team. You know, it's a City of Seattle model, and I think there's a tension here that I think we should name, which is, you know, the navigation team became and is a point of conversation right now because it sort of embeds two different theories that can be in tension. And so some people look at the navigation team and they see it as outreach, as connection, as a way to get folks from where they are into shelter. Other folks look at the navigation team and they see it as an attempt to move people, but not necessarily to house people or to understand people. I don't think it's as simple as either of those. You know, knowing some of the folks who are working on this, I think, you know, it's one of those instances of a siloed system response that's trying really hard to do the right thing, but is working inside of the confines where there's, you know, I think it was Chris who said at the beginning, there are 8, you know, open shelter spaces tonight. You know, and so as important as Amy, and I don't disagree with Amy at all. I agree with Amy, which is a nice way to say that. You know, this is about connection. It is about innovation. And what we have found with outreach is that as soon as you establish trust and relationship, you can become more effective. And you need to have something at the end of that you can actually offer. Outreach gets old if you don't have a place to go, if there are no resources to get connected to, and then people get cynical. And so I think it's how do we do both of these things? Be human-centric, be able to, you know, come back again and again. There are some outreach teams that use this saying, you know, move at the speed of trust. But then you also have to sort of have some, you know, beef. You've got to have a place where you can take people. You got to have access to services that are responsive, that are available. The licensing example is a really good one because you lose credibility over time if you're just talking about wanting to help, but you can't deliver the help. And you also lose credibility if you just want the outcomes, but you don't form the relationships.
Yeah. Kerry, did you have something to add?
I'm just not familiar with your navigation
Gotcha.
team.
Okay. All right. Leo, before we get into audience questions, I wanted to ask you about the 0.1% sales tax that was recently, I think that the county council approved it on Monday or Tuesday of this week. And so that's going to create additional housing for chronically homeless people, correct?
That's right. You know, this, I think, really feeds off of something that Amy's been saying. Everybody agrees that housing is at least a major part of the solution. I have never met a person who said, like, we don't need more housing. Housing has some challenges right now. One, it's super expensive. And two, the sort of flash to bang, to use a Army term, the amount of time before you make the investment versus when the housing comes online is long. It can be years. So we're trying to solve both of those problems with this approach, which is get the cost per unit down. And we think we can get down to about half of what we've traditionally paid with the approach we're taking. And then really go from years from initial idea to housing folks to months to try to, you know, purchase a facility and then get people into it right now instead of trying to build it. And again, it's something that we proved we could do in COVID, where we would lease a hotel and we'd have people in it a week later. And so the 0.1%, we think it'll generate about $50 million a year right now. That's less than it would have if every city in the region had sort of stayed together. A couple cities opted not to, but you know, we're going to keep working with them as we can. We're going to bond against it to try to bring forward what's going to be about $350 or $400 million in capital. My uncertainty there is just trying to figure out how much revenue we're going to get now with the economy doing what it's doing in a couple of cities not joining. And then use that to buy hotels or nursing homes right now where they exist, with many of them having their rate of occupancy at or below 10%. So they're difficult to sort of operate profitably, and see if we can solve a couple of problems at once and innovate at scale to try to bring 2,000 people inside who are experiencing chronic homelessness.
All right. I mean, you know, given all the wonderful ideas and the things that are working in other parts of the world, other parts of the country, and things that are working on a small scale here in the Northwest, what are the hurdles that are in the way of solving what has seemed like a intractable problem for so many years?
I'll jump in on that just from Los Angeles. I'm going to put something in the chat that is a little bit, now that I don't run the bid anymore, I'm allowed to speak up more. So those of you who work for the Downtown Seattle Association probably know exactly what I'm talking about, but I feel like I'm a free bird now as a citizen. And we have a little group that has come together. So to Leo's point, when COVID hit in Los Angeles, immediately there was such hope in the air because our mayor and our board of supervisors kind of banded together and took advantage of the emergency powers that had been granted by the state to just like rock and roll. We saw things happen in 2 months that would have taken 10 years to happen. Project Room Key, the hotels that were being leased up with FEMA money, quarantine sites set up at the beach and using hotels, parks and recreation centers that were converted into emergency shelters, just rapid fire response. And for many of us who had been in this space for a long time, we said, we always felt this was a state of emergency, and there needed to be consolidation of authority because Los Angeles is a very disaggregated local government system, probably more disaggregated than Seattle and King County. And then what started happening in June is they started slowly but surely, without telling anyone, unraveling these recreation shelters and started moving people out of Project Room Key. And we're like, time out, the pandemic is not over. If anything, it could become worse. And the economic dislocation we anticipate in Los Angeles could also become worse. This crisis is far from over. So this little thing I put in the chat box is a kind of a call to action that we have lost faith in the ability of our local governments to really respond to this crisis. And there needs to be some kind of consolidation of authority, or a czar. I hate to use that word, but I think we all know what it means. There needs to be a place where the buck stops and that there's accountability and resources and authority vested. And in our letter, we say for a time-limited space, 18 months, 2 years, until we get to herd immunity or until Venus, explodes, name a time. But that's a movement happening in Los Angeles right now because of the deep, deep frustration of the community that this problem is getting worse, actually.
Yeah. And we've had a declared emergency here in Seattle for several years. Let's take an audience question. This is from Kurt. He says, what do we do in the near term for situations that are devolving rapidly, such as in Denny Park? I have monitored the situation and have been using Find It, Fix It to offer suggestions such as toilets, garbage pickup, and now we need a needle collection until we have a long-term appropriate response to support people. Is that Christopher, are you available to take that question, or? Maybe not.
Yes, I am. Sorry.
Okay.
I just won't be on video, it looks like. Yeah, it's a really difficult question, Kurt. I was actually involved in a meeting yesterday through what is left of the navigation team, which is basically an administrator and 2 city navigators. And the question of Denny Park, I do know that there are a few organizations that are doing focused outreach. I believe Reach and Reach has been out there trying to do some more focused outreach. Also an organization called Just Cares, which is another program through Reach. They're trying to do some focused outreach in that park as well. The difficulty is that because of the disbanding of the navigation team, all litter and I believe this would also include needle pickup has now been delegated to Seattle Public Utilities and to Seattle's Parks and Recreation. And so obviously 2 entities that are already engaged in the work and now being asked to do even more so with not necessarily an increase in resource there. So I think that's why you're seeing some of the slow response there. Then like I shared earlier, as of this morning at 9 o'clock this morning, I got a phone call letting me know that in all of Seattle, we have 8 shelter resources. So it's really difficult to see some more movement in a situation like Denny Park to be able to address some of those issues.
And what you were saying earlier about the 30-day wait to get an appointment, but no appointments being able to be made 30 days in advance to get an ID card, that's sort of a catch-22 thing. Amy mentioned that she hears from people who want to hire people re-entering after, incarceration or something. Where do people turn to get sort of solve these catch-22 issues at the policy level, or just get information on the consumer level about how they can be part of the solution rather than not doing anything about it? And that's for anybody, I guess.
I think that's a great question. As far as I know, there isn't a resource for that. So I think that's part of the problem is we're very disjointed. And I think that's true everywhere. I don't think that's just Seattle, like Kerry mentioned it in LA, right? So the city departments, especially in big cities like ours and like LA, the departments are disjointed. They're not speaking to one another necessarily. I don't know how to fix that. And then you have all of these human services groups, like Christopher mentioned, REACH, and there's a ton of great programs, diversion programs and recovery programs, and there's not enough shelter beds, but there are programs out there. They're all kind of engaged in what I call resource hoarding, which is not a negative term. I mean, there's not enough resources to go around. And so there's not enough people, there's not enough money, there's not enough of anything to do what they need to do. And what they often do is sort of close in like this and say, well, we've got what we've got, and we'll help whoever comes to our door. But what needs to happen, and this is the point of 1426, is a place where everybody's using the same door. So if you have a person that needs services, they can come to one place and they've got a county official there who says, yeah, let me connect you with an appointment to get your ID. Oh, and you also need help with your kids and family reunification. Great, we have a lawyer here that can help with that. You need housing, we've got housing resources. You need a job, we can help you build a resume and find connections to employment. And now each of those single entities can conserve their resources that they have for what they're good at, rather than everybody trying to be everything to all people. When you get a client that comes to you and they say, I need 20 different things, and you try to resolve all 20 things, you're wasting your precious resources on things you're not good at that somebody else could do a lot faster and cheaper. So we need to figure out how to get everybody on the same page and engage the whole community, right? We're never gonna solve this without the business community engaging, the human services, government, everybody has to be at the table, faith-based groups. I know there's a lot of like, I don't want to engage with different people, and we're very polarized, but that polarization is preventing us from working together. And the more we can work together and share the resources we have, the better we will do. And part of that regional housing authority, or the regional homelessness authority, is to address that, I think. But since it's not up yet, we need the community to step up and really fill that gap. So I think that's one way people can help, is look at your business and say, what can we do as a business community? How can our business contribute? It might be money, it might be volunteering, it might be resources and time and helping with something else, helping to clean up a park, whatever. But there's a lot of different groups out there that you can engage with.
I think one thing, if I may add to what Amy said real quick, is that social service providers and everyone, we are working together. I do believe that there has been a history of resource hoarding and all of that, but I think to a point, or an earlier point that Leo made that was really helpful, was we have a fragmented system that has fragmented funding. And so what might come across as resource hoarding, it's not, it's due to the way that grants are rented or anything like that. We all have particular populations that we have to serve, or individuals. And again, it's part of the dysfunction of our system right now. Individuals have to meet certain criteria in order for other organizations to work with them, and that's where I'm thankful for my position here at DSA, is that we are able to, since we are a VIA funded program, we are able to not have as many stringent criteria as other programs might have. DSC hosts, which is a fantastic program. Part of the criteria there is that as a mental health clinician, I have to be able to determine that this individual has severe mental illness, that they are showing enough symptoms of that. And I also have to be able to make a case that traditional mental health care is not going to be a solution here. And so I think that's where what might come across as resource hoarding, it's not. It's simply a matter of, due to the way the funding structure is, whether it's a city contract or whether it's federal funding or being able to bill Medicaid, it has to fall into certain criteria in order to make that happen. So I think that's just one thing I wanted to add to Amy's thing, but we are working together as best as we can.
Yeah, and to clarify, Christopher, I didn't mean that in a negative way. I think
no, absolutely.
I think the resource hoarding happens by necessity. It's not a not a selfish thing.
Yeah.
I might have made it come across that way, and I apologize.
No.
It's more of a necessity thing. And I think the other piece that you mentioned is a lot of the grants and the funding are specific to certain issues, but people don't have just one issue. So they don't fit in that box. So we say, well, you can help this person because they're a veteran, or you can help this person because they have an addiction issue, or you can help this person because X, right? But that person might be a veteran with an addiction issue and mental health concerns, PTSD, and they're unsheltered, and they have a housing, childcare issue. Now you have 6 problems, but your funding only covers 1 of those 6. So what are you going to do? You're going to say that's the hoarding, right? You're not hoarding. You're saying I only have enough resources to help you on this one issue because that's what my grant is for. But I know you have 6 issues, and I really want to help you with that. So then you have to work with other organizations to get those other issues. So thank you. That's a much better perspective than how I put it. So thank you.
And Leo, you're going to respond?
Yeah, I think, I see that we're, getting to 10. And so I think there are three other things that are just worth saying here. One is there can be no credible conversation about unattended mental health benefit or experiences in homelessness without acknowledging racism. Racism is not the cause of all homelessness, but it is the cause of a lot of homelessness, and Black and Native populations in particularly are shockingly disproportionately represented. And that's not a mistake. You can draw that back to centuries-long policies in our country that systematically deprived, or worse, those two populations in particular. So I think you just always have to name that as part of what's going on. Two, there are smart people on this call. If anybody can help me think of a better way, a more effective way to cite a shelter or an affordable housing project, I welcome it. You have never done anything as hard as trying to cite the thing that everybody agrees that we need. Everybody wants it. No one wants it right next to them. And that's a problem that we're going to have to collectively solve. And then three, I know there's a lot of, the nonprofit industrial, complex, and people are getting rich out there. I was a legal aid attorney who was serving primarily homeless clients. I had a law degree. I was a veteran. I made $50,000 a year living in Seattle with my family. My kids were on Medicaid. And we have a system in which we underpay the people, the human capital, who are trying to do the work that we all agree is super important. And we're gonna have to fix that if we expect people to perform at a really high level, stay in these jobs for a long time. Human capital is a huge part of solving this problem eventually.
Yeah, I mean, so just one quick last question here before we wrap things up, and as a follow-up to that. Do you think the COVID-19 crisis, the racial injustice crisis, everything we've experienced the last 6, 7, 8 months, particularly if there's a new administration come January 20th, is this a great opportunity to sort of reformat how we think about what we pay people and how we value certain jobs that to date have not been, as you've said, sort of compensated in a way that makes them sustainable?
I think we've got to, and I want to own my part in that. I'm a government funder, so we have a part in this. But it should not surprise any of us that our effectiveness follows our emphasis. And we have not emphasized the people who do this work, and it should not surprise us, therefore, that they feel unsupported and are not as successful as they otherwise would be.
All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today for this DSA program. I want to thank our panelists, Leo Floor, Kerry Morrison, Amy King, and Chris Park with DSA. And please plan on joining us for our next presentation on November 19th. More information at the DSA website. I'm Felix Bunnell for the Downtown Seattle Association. Thank you so much for taking part in today's program.